The first thing Fleet Commander Breth noticed was the silence. Not the silence of space that was expected. Absolute, a constant companion to any who sailed between the stars. This was different. This was the silence of something that had been there a moment ago and now wasn't. His long-range acoustic sensors, calibrated to detect the quantum resonance signatures of active communication arrays, were returning nothing. Not static. Not interference. Nothing. As if an entire planet had simply stopped broadcasting. He checked the timestamp. The silence had begun exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds after his Armada dropped out of full transit in the outer orbital band of the third planet. A blue-green world. Small. Unremarkable. The species that lived there had no faster-than-light travel, no energy weapons of consequence, no fleet capable of engaging even a single hegemony patrol cruiser, let alone the 412 ships now forming a perfect enclosure around their home. Breth had expected fear. He had expected desperate transmissions, frantic broadcasts, the kind of noise that prey animals make when they realize the net has closed. What he had not expected was this deliberate, considered quiet. "They know we're here," said Subcommander Tallis from the tactical station behind him. Her voice carried the precise, clipped confidence of someone who had participated in 37 planetary subjugations. "The silence is capitulation protocol. They're shutting down non-essential systems to signal peaceful surrender." Breth stared at his display. 412 ships. Combined firepower sufficient to render the planet's surface uninhabitable within 6 hours. The mathematics of this situation were not complicated. And yet, "Get me a translation team," he said quietly. "I want to know exactly what they were broadcasting before they stopped." 3 mysteries settled into his mind without announcing themselves. Why had the silence been so perfectly timed to their arrival? What had the humans been saying to each other in that final window? And why, when he looked at the thermal imaging of the planet's surface, did he see what appeared to be millions of people moving? Not toward shelter, not away from population centers, but toward something, gathering, converging on specific coordinates with the purposeful geometry of entities who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The translation team worked fast. They were good at their job. The hegemony didn't employ slow people. Within 11 minutes, they had reconstructed and decoded the final 40 seconds of humanity's global broadcast before the silence fell. It wasn't a surrender announcement. It wasn't a distress call. It was a countdown. A countdown to what? Tallis asked when the lead translator, a nervous specialist named Corvin, delivered the report in person rather than transmitting it. That detail alone should have told them something. Corvin set his data slate on the command table with hands that weren't quite steady. "We don't know, Sub-Commander." The countdown was synchronized across approximately 11,000 separate broadcast frequencies simultaneously. The final word spoken on every frequency was the same. It translates approximately as, "Now." The room was quiet for a moment. "That was 4 minutes ago," Breth said. "Yes, Fleet Commander." Breth turned back to the viewport. 412 ships. Perfect enclosure. A species that had never traveled between the stars. Never built a weapon that could threaten anything outside their own atmosphere. They had said now 4 minutes ago. And since then, nothing. "Run a complete spatial scan," Breth said. "Every wavelength. Every spectrum. I want to know if anything has changed in this system since we arrived." The answer came back in under 2 minutes. And the sensor operator's voice had a quality in it that Breth had never heard from a hegemony officer before. A quality that took him a moment to identify because it was so foreign to his experience of trained professionals. The quality was uncertainty bordering on fear. "Fleet Commander, the spatial topography of this system has changed." "Changed how?" A pause. "I don't have a framework for how to describe it accurately." Breth crossed the bridge in 4 strides. He stood at the sensor display and looked at what his instruments were telling him. He looked for a long time. He was not a man who needed lengthy explanations as a rule. He understood complex information quickly. It was why he had this command. He looked at the display, and he could not make it mean anything he recognized. The space around Earth, the local geometry of it, The three-dimensional fabric of normal spacetime within approximately 2.3 million kilometers of the planet's surface had changed its shape. Not catastrophically, not violently, it had simply rearranged like a net drawing inward. The topography was still space, still vacuum, still obeying every law of physics he knew. But the relationships between points in that space, the distances, the angles, the navigational constants his pilots relied on to calculate trajectories, had all shifted by a consistent 3.7% in every direction. 3.7% toward Earth. His armada of 412 ships was now, in a mathematical sense that his instruments confirmed but his mind struggled to process, 3.7% closer to the planet than it had been, and 3.7% farther from everywhere else. They moved space, Tallis said. That's not what happened, Breath replied, though he wasn't confident enough in that to put real force behind it. Then what happened? He didn't answer because he didn't have one. Instead, he asked the question that was already keeping him awake at a biological level, one his combat training couldn't quite suppress. How long have they had this capability? Nobody on the bridge could answer that either. The sensor operator spoke carefully. Fleet Commander, I'm running historical spatial surveys of this system from our archives. Hegemony survey ships have passed through this region 44 times in the last 2 centuries. I'm comparing those archived surveys to current readings. Another pause. Longer this time. The spatial topography of this system has been incrementally, consistently different from standard vacuum geometry for at least 160 years, Fleet Commander. The deviation has been growing slowly, very slowly. Approximately 0.002% per decade. We never flagged it because it was within the acceptable margin of sensor drift. Breath felt something he rarely felt. He was careful not to let it reach his face. The humans hadn't built this capability recently. They had been building it for 160 years. Quietly, consistently, inside a margin of error so small that every hegemony survey ship that had passed through this system had dismissed it as instrument noise. They knew we were watching them, Breath said. It wasn't a question. Fleet Commander, the sensor operator said, and now there was a different quality in the voice. Not fear exactly, but the specific cognitive discomfort of a person who had just realized the ground they were standing on was not what they believed it to be. I need to flag something else. Say it. The spatial modification isn't uniform. It has a structure, a deliberate architecture. I've been trying to map it for the last several minutes, and I've identified what appear to be corridors, specific vectors through the modified space that maintain standard geometry. Like pathways. Breath studied the display. The corridors were clear once you knew to look for them. Precise. Intentional. Running from specific points in the surrounding space directly to the planet's surface. Running from the current positions of specific ships in his armada. Specific ships. Not all of them. Not randomly. Specific ones. Which vessels do the corridors terminate at? Breath asked, though some part of him already knew this was a question whose answer was going to make the next hour considerably worse. The command ships, Fleet Commander. Every vessel in the armada that carries flag rank or tactical override authority. The corridors are aligned to the precise positions of the 12 command-grade ships. 12 out of 412. The humans hadn't modified the space around the entire armada. They had modified it around the decision-makers. Breath stood at his display and did something he had not done in a professional context since his first command. He thought very carefully about what he was about to do next without trusting his first instinct. On the surface of Earth, in a room that bore no particular resemblance to a military operations center, it looked more like a university's aging computer lab, all mismatched chairs and coffee-stained tables and screens of varying sizes. A woman named Dr. Sira Voss was watching 12 green indicators on a display board remain stubbornly, beautifully lit. They haven't moved, said the young man next to her. Jin, who had been awake for 41 hours, looked it. No, Sira agreed. Is that good? She considered this seriously rather than offering him easy reassurance. It means they're thinking. Thinking is good. Thinking is the gap between the bomb and the detonator. Jin looked at the display. The green lights represented the spatial lock acquisitions. 12 of them, anchored to the 12 largest power signatures in the Armada overhead. How long can we hold the geometry? The lattice is stable. We can hold it indefinitely, as long as the anchor nodes stay operational. A pause. 47 of our 112 anchor nodes are in cities that are within that Armada's weapons range. I know. If they decide to fire before they decide to think, we lose a third of the lattice. I know, Syrah. She nodded once and didn't elaborate. There was nothing to elaborate on. They had built this system for 160 years across 7 generations of engineers and physicists who had each understood only their own piece of it, who had each died without seeing it used, and who had each trusted that the piece they were building would fit into a hole they would never witness. That was the deal. That had always been the deal. They're going to want to talk to someone, Jin said. Yes. Who do we send? Syrah looked at the display for a long moment. Someone who understands that the conversation isn't really the point. The communication request came from the surface of Earth 47 minutes after the Armada's arrival. Breath accepted it because refusing a communication request from a species that had just demonstrated the ability to selectively modify the spacetime around his command ships seemed like the kind of decision he would regret in whatever time he had remaining to regret things. The face that appeared on his screen was a human female. Older. The kind of face that had spent decades doing something difficult and didn't bother trying to look like it hadn't. She didn't introduce herself. You've had time to look at your sensors, she said. Her words came through the translation system with a half-second lag and an almost perfect rendering of the original tone. The translation AI flagged her speaking pattern as non-deferential, expected authority, high comm index. I have, Breath replied. Then you understand that this isn't a negotiation. Breath felt his secondary heart, the redundant cardiovascular organ hegemony biology provided as an emergency pump under extreme stress, begin cycling. He kept his voice level. What is it? An invitation to make a decision before we have to make one for you. Behind her, Breath could see what appeared to be a completely ordinary room. Screens, chairs, a cup of something hot that was losing steam. He focused on that cup for a moment because his mind wanted an anchor to something normal, something that followed recognizable rules. You've spent 160 years building something you hoped you'd never have to use, he said. For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly. Something more like calibration. She had not expected him to understand that quickly. He noted her reassessment and felt, in spite of everything, a small, precise satisfaction. Yes, she said. Why not build weapons instead? You had the technological foundation. You had the time. She looked at him with an expression his translation system didn't have a category for. Because weapons would have told you we were dangerous, and you would have come sooner with more ships. Breath sat with that for a moment. It was the most tactically honest thing anyone had ever said to him in a first contact communication. What do you want? He asked. For you to leave and to tell the hegemony what you found here. A slight pause. Accurately. What Breath didn't know, what he couldn't know yet, because the spatial modifications were only the visible surface of what humanity had built, was that the lattice was not primarily a defensive system. The lattice was a record. Every spatial modification, every careful increment of geometric adjustment made over 160 years had been encoded. Not just the physics of it. The data. The observations. Everything humanity had learned about every species that had passed through their system in 2 centuries of careful, silent watching. 44 hegemony survey ships. Each one logged. Each one's technology reverse-engineered from passive scans. Each one's communication frequencies recorded and decoded. Over the following decades, while the hegemony had been surveilling Earth, Earth had been surveilling the hegemony. And the lattice, in addition to its spatial properties, was a transmission system. Every anchor node was also a broadcast node. If the Armada fired, if the command to weapons free was given and the anchor nodes in those 47 cities were destroyed, the lattice would collapse. And its collapse, specifically engineered, would release everything it contained as a broadband transmission across every frequency the hegemony used, readable by every ship in range. Every survey they had ignored. Every passive scan they had dismissed as primitive. Every communication they had assumed was too technologically crude to conceal its content. All of it decoded, organized, and transmitted to the entire hegemony fleet in the 11 seconds it would take the lattice to unravel. The Armada couldn't fire on Earth without simultaneously broadcasting the most comprehensive intelligence package on hegemony internal communications, fleet positioning, and technological specifications ever assembled to every hegemony ship in range. Yes, but also to every non-hegemony receiver that happened to be listening. The hegemony had 71 active political enemies. Most of them were always listening. Syrah hadn't told Breath this. She wouldn't unless she had to, because the point of a deterrent isn't the deterrent. The point is the decision it forces on the other party before the deterrent is ever deployed. The gap between the bomb and the detonator. She watched Breath's face on her screen. She watched him thinking. She could tell, in the particular way his jaw had shifted fractionally and the quality of his attention had changed, that he was running through scenarios. And the scenarios were not resolving in satisfying ways. She had studied hegemony command psychology for 11 years. She had a good sense of what a hegemony fleet commander looked like when he realized that the tactical situation he had arrived expecting was not the tactical situation he was currently in. "You're not the first contact we've had with your species," Breath said finally. This was not a question. He was testing her. "No," she said honestly. "The survey ships. Yes. You let them leave. We let all of them leave. We wanted you to think you understood this system. We wanted you to think we were unremarkable." Pause. "We needed the time." Breath looked at her for a long moment. "You've been managing our perception of you for a century and a half. We've been managing everyone's perception of us. Not just yours." That landed differently than she had intended. She saw it in his face. He had been operating under the assumption that this was about the hegemony, that humanity had identified the hegemony as the threat and built the lattice in response to them specifically. The idea that humanity had been playing a longer, wider game than that the lattice wasn't a response to the hegemony, but a response to the general condition of being a young species in a galaxy full of older, more powerful ones. She could see him rearranging his model of the situation around that single point. It was making everything worse for him. Good. Breath called a command conference. This was unusual. He had the authority to make decisions unilaterally, and his officers knew it, which made the conference itself a message about the gravity of the situation. He was too professional to state that directly. 12 flag officers on 12 command ships. Faces arranged in a grid on his screen. All of them aware, at some level, that the space around their vessels had been architecturally rearranged by the planet they had come to subjugate. "Options," he said. Rear Admiral Messon, the most combat-experienced officer in the group, spoke first. She was exactly the type of person who should have been reassuring in a moment like this because she was never alarmed. "We fire. We destroy the anchor nodes they've built. We disrupt whatever mechanism creates the spatial modification, and we proceed with standard subjugation protocol." "They've anticipated that," said Fleet Analyst Corey, whose job was specifically to find the things that other people hadn't noticed. "The spatial modification isn't a weapon. It doesn't threaten us directly. It's an anchor, which means when we destroy the anchor nodes, the modification collapses," Messon said. "Yes. I need to know what a collapse of a spatial modification of this scale and duration looks like." "I don't know. None of you know. That's the problem." Corey's voice was steady, but something behind it wasn't. "We've never seen this before. Not in any hegemony record. Not in the xenological archive. Not anywhere." The room, all 12 separate rooms represented on 12 screens, was quiet. "They built something we've never seen," Tallis said from behind Breath. She wasn't flag rank and shouldn't have been speaking in this conference. Nobody told her to stop. "In the space they live in. Right in front of us. For 160 years. We could withdraw," offered Admiral Preth from his ship at the far edge of the enclosure. He said it carefully, in the tone of someone introducing an option he expected to be dismissed, which was its own kind of information. "In return," Breath asked. "With more resources." different resources, a scientific assessment team rather than a combat fleet. They'd know we were coming. They already know everything we do, Preth said quietly. I think we've established that. Breth looked at the grid of faces. 12 of the best military minds the hegemony had placed in this theater, and none of them could give him a scenario in which the next 6 hours ended cleanly. He thought about what the human woman had said. Tell the hegemony what you found here. Accurately. ***. Not tell them we can destroy you. Not tell them we're a threat. Tell them what you found. She's not asking us to be afraid of them, he said slowly. Talus looked at the fleet commander. She's asking us to understand them. There's a difference. He stared at the display. The green spatial topology curves. The corridors pointing with polite precision at his command ships. She knows we can still fire. She knows she can't stop us from trying. She's not pretending otherwise. She's simply showing us that the cost of trying is higher than we budgeted for. A pause. And that it will keep being higher progressively. Something was assembling in his mind. Picture built from fragments. 160 years. 7 generations. A lattice built inside a sensor margin of error. 44 survey ships logged and studied and allowed to leave. A countdown that everyone on the planet synchronized to within the same second. Millions of people converging on geographic coordinates that turned out to be the anchor node sites. People protecting the nodes, he realized. The people near the nodes, he said. The gatherings we saw on thermal imaging, they're not civilians evacuating. Corvin checked his files. Checked again. No, he said. They're gathered around the anchor sites. Approximately 2,000 to 8,000 individuals at each of the 47 urban node locations. Standing between the nodes and our weapons. The silence on the conference call had a different texture than the silence before it. They can't shield the nodes with their bodies, Messon said. But her voice had lost the automatic confidence of a few minutes ago. Our weapons would. Yes, Breth said. They know that. Then why? Because it's not about stopping the weapons. Something cold was settling through him. It's about making a choice of a particular kind in front of a particular audience. They're not protecting the nodes. They're documenting what we choose to do. He looked at the transmission architecture the sensor team had just partially mapped. Every anchor node is also a broadcast node. If we fire on those cities, the lattice collapses and broadcasts everything it contains. Everything they've recorded. But even before that, every human on that planet who isn't standing at a node site is watching. Recording. With whatever technology they have. A pause. And we don't actually know what technology they have, do we? We know what they've chosen to show us. That landed like a hull breach. He could see it in their faces. They had spent 160 years managing what the hegemony saw. The lattice was visible, deliberately visible now that it had activated. It had been designed to be found at this specific moment, which meant everything they hadn't shown was still hidden. There's more, Talus said quietly. Not a question. There's always more, Breth replied. That's the point she's making. Syrah watched Breth's fleet on her display for 4 hours and 17 minutes without the Armada moving. Jin had fallen asleep in his chair around hour 2. She'd let him. He'd earned it. She drank 3 cups of the tea she'd been nursing since the Armada arrived and sat with the quiet. The beautiful, engineered quiet of 412 ships doing nothing, which was all she had ever really asked of them. Her radio crackled. Not the long-range communication system. Her personal radio. Handheld. The kind that ran on batteries. South Node 7 reporting in, said a voice from the surface several hundred kilometers away. A young woman's voice. A little breathless from standing outside in what was apparently cold wind. Still holding. People here are holding. We have approximately 4,000 standing in the open. There was a brief pause. Something shifted in the voice. They're singing, Dr. Voss. I don't know when that started. They're just singing. Syrah closed her eyes for a moment. Tell them thank you, she said into the radio. Tell them it's going well. She didn't know yet if that was true. She knew the Armada hadn't fired. She knew Breth was thinking. She knew that thinking was the gap. But she had been part of this project long enough to understand that the gap could close in either direction. And that every generation that had built some piece of the lattice had understood the same thing, and had built their piece anyway. That was the part she had never been able to explain adequately to people who asked about the project. Not the physics, not the encoding, not the spatial geometry. The part she couldn't explain was why. Why 7 generations of people had worked on something most of them would never see completed. That might fail. That might not be enough. That might end in a flash of orbital fire before it ever had the chance to prove itself. She had asked her own mentor that question once, 40 years ago, when she'd first joined the project as a young physicist who thought it was primarily an interesting theoretical problem. Because it was the next right thing, the old man had told her. At the time, she had thought that was an unsatisfying answer. She had grown slowly over 4 decades into understanding that it was the only honest one. When Breath finally opened the channel again, his face had the look of someone who had thoroughly examined a problem from every angle available, and arrived at a conclusion he respected, even if it wasn't what he had come there to achieve. The hegemony will want to understand what you've built, he said. I know, Sira said. There will be others who come after me. Scientists, analysts, diplomats. I know. You understand that what you've demonstrated here will change your relationship with the hegemony permanently. You won't be an unregistered pre-contact species anymore. You'll be. He paused. She had the sense he was choosing his words with unusual care. Something else. Something that requires a different kind of attention, she offered. Yes. Good. Breath was quiet for a moment. Then the people at your anchor nodes. The ones standing in the open. Yes. They knew we might fire. Yes. They stayed anyway. Sira looked at Jin, still asleep in his chair. At the green indicators still lit on the board. At the steam no longer rising from her 4th cup of tea. They've been staying for 160 years, she said. Generation after generation. People who started this work knowing they'd never see it finished. People who finished pieces of it knowing they'd never see it used. People who stood at nodes today knowing you might fire and that they couldn't stop it. She paused. That's not courage we manufactured for this moment. That's just what they are. She watched Breath's face process this. Watched him arrive somewhere she recognized. The place where the math stops working, and something else has to substitute for it. I'm going to withdraw the fleet, he said. I'm going to report what I found here accurately, as you asked. Thank you. Don't thank me. Something complex moved through his expression. I'm withdrawing because I cannot construct a scenario in which engaging with humanity right now ends in a way that the hegemony considers a success. That's a military calculation, not admiration. I know, Sira said. But, he paused again. The pause was longer than a translation lag. It was the pause of a person saying something they hadn't planned to say. I've been in this command for 20 years. I've subjugated 19 species. I've never encountered a species that prepared for us the way you did. Not as a dominant species would. Not with weapons and fleets and visible power. But as... He stopped again. As prey that decided to become something harder to eat, Sira offered quietly. Breath looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. Exactly that. The Armada began its withdrawal 40 minutes later. It was not a retreat in any military sense. It was executed with precision and held formation throughout. But it moved, and the direction it moved was away from Earth. Sira watched the indicators change on her board. Watched the red proximity warnings shift to yellow, then to the pale green of safe distance hold. She didn't celebrate. None of them celebrated. The people at the node site stayed for another 2 hours until the all-clear was formally broadcast. Then they dispersed as quietly as they had gathered, back to their homes, their lives, their ordinary days. Jin woke up and saw the board and sat with it for a moment without speaking. Did it work? He asked finally. For now, Sira said. What happens next? She thought about this honestly, the same way she had been trying to think honestly about everything for 40 years. They'll come back with different people asking different questions. They'll try to understand the lattice. They'll try to figure out what else we know and haven't shown them. They'll debate internally about what category of species we are and what their policy toward us should be. A pause. And while they're doing all of that, we'll keep building. Building what? She looked at the display, at the spatial topology curves, at the century and a half of careful, quiet, patient work that had bought them today. The next right thing, she said. Same as always. The final report that Fleet Commander Breath submitted to Hegemony High Command was thorough, accurate, and deeply uncomfortable to read. It circulated through 17 levels of hegemony bureaucracy over the following months, leaving a specific kind of silence in its wake. The silence of institutions that had encountered information they didn't have an adequate framework for and were quietly panicking about how to develop one. The section of the report that generated the most internal discussion was not the description of the lattice. It was not the spatial modification data or the broadcast architecture or even the strategic implications of a species that had managed hegemony perception of them for a century and a half. It was a single paragraph near the end, where Breath departed from standard military report format and wrote in his own words, without the detached, passive construction of official documentation. The humans I observed were not exceptional individuals performing exceptional acts. They were ordinary individuals by every biological and psychological metric. Thoroughly ordinary, doing something consistent and patient and unremarkable on any given day, sustained across a time frame that exceeds the institutional memory of most hegemony military commands. They did not build what they built because they were stronger than us, or faster than us, or more intelligent than us. They built it because they decided to, and because they kept deciding to every day for 7 generations, when any rational analysis of their situation would have concluded the effort was likely futile. That is not a military capability I know how to quantify. That is not a threat profile I know how to categorize. I can tell you what their lattice does. I cannot tell you what they will build next or when, or what it will take to make them stop. I am not certain it is possible to make them stop. That uncertainty is, I believe, the most honest and important thing I can report. The report was classified at the highest level the hegemony had. 17 copies were made and distributed to senior command. Within a year, 12 of those copies had been leaked to parties the hegemony had not intended to share them with, which was either a security failure or, as some of the more careful analysts quietly suggested in communications, exactly what the humans had anticipated would happen. Across the galaxy, in the offices and command centers and political chambers of 71 hegemony adversaries, 43 neutral parties, and 9 species that had thought of themselves as too small to matter, the same document arrived in various forms. It was read by people who had spent their careers learning what other species were capable of and who found themselves sitting quietly with a paragraph about a planet of ordinary individuals and 7 generations of consistent, patient, unremarkable choices, feeling, without quite being able to articulate why, that something about the galaxy had shifted. Not because humanity was the strongest species among them. Not because the lattice was the most powerful technology they had encountered. But because, in a galaxy where every civilization measured its security by what it could threaten and what it could withstand, humanity had built something that operated on a completely different logic. Patient, distributed, encoded in generations, disguised as nothing, activated only when necessary, maintained by people standing in the cold wind, singing songs to each other while a fleet of warships decided their fate. And the question that lingered in Breath's report, in the classified analyses, in the quiet conversations of species who had just learned that a planet they had dismissed was watching them, had always been watching them, carefully, thoroughly, without anyone knowing, was not whether humanity was dangerous. The question was whether any civilization in the galaxy, given enough time and sufficient quiet, was safe from a species that had decided, in its unremarkable, patient, ordinary way, that it was not willing to stop.